This is an article from April 3rd, 2002. Porn and Politics in Palestine. When Palestinian residents of the besieged West Bank town of Ramallah turned on their TVs over the weekend, what they encountered was neither news nor any of the usual Palestinian Authority programming. They encountered pornographic movie clips. 3 of the 4 TV stations in Ramallah, headquarters of Yasser Arafat, had been occupied by Israeli troops. The town's remaining TV station was meanwhile running a crawl at the bottom of the screen, explaining that the porn clips were the work of the occupying forces. An Israeli army spokesman told the press that their forces had nothing to do with such clips, and even blamed Arafat for the footage. Arafat is willing to go low in order to make himself look better in this uncomfortable situation, said the spokesman. This is officially referred to as the Ramallah pornography controversy, which of course implies some sort of doubt as to its authenticity, or at least the cause of the pornographic images being played on Palestinian television stations. 3 of which that were actually playing the porn movies just so happened to be occupied by Israeli soldiers, but of course naturally they denied any sort of involvement in this and went so far as to imply that, oh no, it was actually your own leader who put these images on your television screens to try and make us look worse than we actually are. But regardless of the source, this is a very interesting case study in the sense that you have to remember this was 2002 in a Muslim country that had a very strict policy on pornography, to the point where the only way to access it would be on the internet, and the internet was nowhere near what it is today, especially in Palestine. So the only way that these people would ever be exposed to hardcore pornography would be accidentally, unless they somehow had access to a computer. But for the majority of the population, it would have to be something like this. And so you have this situation where it's a war, everyone is under house arrest essentially, they can't even go get groceries, and so their only form of information is the television. And you have 3 of the television stations being occupied by Israeli forces, and they're playing hardcore pornography on the news as a form of psychological warfare. And it really makes you think, right? If this is a form of psychological warfare in an actual wartime setting, what does that say about our current situation in relationship to pornography? Where it is ubiquitous. It is a click away. I'll read further, just a little bit here, so you see what I mean. Modern psychological warfare often makes use of unlikely media. When U.S. forces had Panama's Manuel Noriega surrounded a few years ago, they bombarded him around the clock with raucous rock music. FBI agents have done the same in domestic siege situations. The idea, apparently, is to locate a cultural form that discomforts the target and to subject that target to an unending stream of it. And then this is in reference to what happened in Ramallah. More likely is that the sudden exposure to hardcore pornographic imagery would come as a psychological shock to those unaccustomed to it. I randomly came across this story a few weeks ago, and it really got me thinking about pornography and my own experience with it, especially in relation to psychological warfare. And I'm not trying to discuss it from the perspective of the people involved, both the performers and the directors, and that whole infrastructure that exists around it. It is what it is. It's a symptom of a disease. It's interesting looking at the development of internet pornography in hindsight. You have 9/11 and the Millennium Hilton at Ground Zero, shaped as the movie screen from Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. But a whole nother angle to that, aside from all the 9/11 stuff, is that Paris Hilton had probably the most famous sex tape of the 2000s. And by the way, Paris Hilton's sister, Nikki Hilton, recently, a few years ago, married into the Rothschild family. So do you suppose it's an accident that the Hiltons married into the Rothschild bloodline? Their hotel was shaped as the screen monolith at Ground Zero on 9/11, and then their other daughter, Paris, has this infamous sex tape leaked, quote unquote, with Rick Solomon. And she thereafter becomes the first ever social media star, famous for being famous. There was recently a documentary that came out about Paris Hilton, how she's the OG of social media, how a lot of the tactics and strategies that she developed as a social media star have been copy and pasted by all of these clones that have come after her. How she provided the formula for social media. Do you suppose it's an accident that it was Paris Hilton, given what I just went over, who started all of this? Or at least brought it into the public consciousness. And do you suppose it's an accident that all of that was brought about by subconsciously linking it to sex and pornography? And then who came after Paris Hilton? Well, of course, Kim Kardashian, who rose to infamy with her own sex tape. And of course, Kim Kardashian's father, Robert Kardashian, was an attorney, and he represented O.J. Simpson in the O.J. Simpson trial. And then her mother's husband, Bruce Jenner, subsequently decides that he's now going to be a woman. Time Magazine's Woman of the Year, in fact. And this plays further into the cultural subversion of the collective morality of the general population. There's all the colloquialisms, sex sells, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, that was a part of what they sold to everybody in the 60s and 70s, you know, free love. No one ever wants to admit that they've been programmed. They want to find justifications for their behavior. Pornography is so insidious. All around the world right now, as I'm speaking, there are people acting out their own subconscious, maybe, it could be conscious, but a lot of times it's subconscious, sexual programming. They are mimicking what they see in pornography movies. This is how normal people think that the act, the incredibly intimate, sacred act of sexual intercourse, they're playing it out like they saw it portrayed in a porn movie. Ejaculating on a girl's face? What? Have you ever stopped and thought about how sick that is? In terms of the fact that this is the energy of life that is being emitted in that moment, and you're just defiling the opposite sex with it. What is this? Would anybody born into a vacuum without any of this porn, would a woman wake up one morning and say, "Hey, I think I want you to ejaculate on my face, please"? Yes. That's sexy and hot. What? The acts that are depicted in hardcore pornography are disgusting. They are not what any of us should be doing. And the programming is so strong that there are people that will listen to me say that, and they'll like try to come up with some excuse and say that I'm sexually repressed or some craziness like that. That I'm not, liberated like they are. That's how strong the mind control is, I remember the first time that I was exposed to hardcore pornography. I was in my early teens, and it was the summer, and we were just out all hanging out, probably playing football or something, and I just remember at one point on one day, we ended up inside at one of my friends' houses, and their older brother and some of his friends were over, and they decided that it would be a funny, good idea to show us some porn. And I'll never forget the complete and utter shock that I experienced when he pressed play on that VCR tape. And by the way, that's showing you the time period that this was. This was, the mid-90s. Yes, we were still using VCRs back then. And the complete and utter shock that I experienced when those images first came on the screen, I had never seen anything like that. It was insane. It was crazy. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I mean, of course, you learn about it when you have your little sex education class in grade school or whatever, but it's a completely different thing reading and learning about it than it is seeing some hardcore depiction of it. And from that moment on, my mind was corrupted. In hindsight, I mean, of course I didn't realize it at the time, but in hindsight, I lost my innocence in that moment. Up until that point, I was so innocent in so many ways, and that innocence was stolen from me when I was exposed to those images. And that's what I initially thought of when I was reading that random story about the Ramallah pornography controversy, where the Israeli troops allegedly streamed hardcore pornography into the homes of the opposition, as it were, in an attempt to shock them as a form of psychological warfare. And if this was a tactic of theirs during war, well, I can see why the pornography industry exists in the first place, and I can further see why it has been so promoted and proliferated on the internet for free. These pornography websites are all within the top 25 most trafficked websites in the world. It's an epidemic. And it is I was going to say the main reason, but maybe not the main, but at least one of the strongest reasons why the relationships between men and women are so off-centered, so distorted, so far from what they were intended to be. And I mean, there's so many things that play off of the pornography that it might take all day to list them all, Then you have, there's the impact on children who, I was a teenager when I was exposed to this, but due to the proliferation of the internet and parents giving in to peer pressure from their children who are exposed to other children with technology, well, they get them cell phones at earlier and earlier ages. They give them laptops and let them be on the internet. And no matter what parental controls are out there, when you're around other kids who have technology, they're inevitably going to be exposed to hardcore pornographic images at earlier and earlier ages. And this leads to the sexualization of children at earlier and earlier ages, where they want to try and reproduce what they see. And so children are having sex at earlier and earlier ages. The sex education classes are, of course, in line with the programming, providing insane ideas to children about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable sexually. That makes me think of another story from my childhood. When I was in grade school, maybe 3rd or 4th grade, I remember I was out at recess one day, and my parents had done a pretty good job of shielding me from certain things. Now, this did make me naive in certain ways, but overall it was a beneficial thing. And I remember I was on the playground one day, we were messing around, and this kid had headphones on. He was listening to music, and he said, "Hey, Steve, you should listen to this and check it out." And I said, "Oh, what is it?" And he goes, oh, it's this guy called Eazy-E. And so I had never heard anything of, gangster rap before. And so he puts these headphones on me, presses play, and I'm just like, whoa, what is this? Totally changed my perception in that moment when I listened to an Eazy-E song. It was. I mean, if you've ever listened to anything by Eazy-E, he was very explicit. I had never heard anything like that before. It had the same impact on me that those first hardcore pornographic images had on me. Again, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And what do people have happen to them when they experience drugs for the first time? It's a similar experience. Similar shocking experience. But then in addition to everything that's going on with the kids and their exposure to this hardcore pornography, well, then you have the way that the dating scene has been changed by technology and the impact of pornography, where you have sites like Tinder. And, I don't know. I've never been on these sites. I just going from what I hear, so I don't know if this is accurate, but apparently you just accept an invitation to go have sex with somebody. This is what people do. It's just like a hookup app. There's no interpersonal relationship. It's just, oh, hey, let's go have sex. Let's go act out a real life moment between us as if we're in a porn. Do you see what I'm saying? The detachment from emotional connection. And then you have women, due to this influence, letting their partners play out this pornographic fantasy by recording them having sex or doing whatever sex act it is. Letting them get out their phone and record it. And then there's this whole problem with revenge porn now, where people are putting these videos up on to websites and ruining people's lives. Because that's the hypocrisy of our society, where everyone wants to point the finger at each other, even though everyone has had sex and probably done that before. They say, oh, well, that person got theirs put up on the internet. Let's shame them now. It's just this whole thing, how there's never going to be any healing as long as that mentality is the dominant mentality in the collective mind. It's such a superficial thing. It's, again, psychological warfare. It's not an accident that all of these things coalesced on top of each other to produce the results that we're witnessing in real time. And the temptation for a lot of people would be to say, well, let's ban pornography. Oh, well, I mean, that's no different than banning alcohol. It'll never work. There'll just be a black market that'll spring up, and the people that want to drink are going to find a way to drink. It's something that would have to come from everybody. Every person living on the planet right now would have to say that I am no longer going to watch pornography. And if every single person did that, well, then pornography would disappear. That's the only way. You can't use this corrupt system to legislate morals. I mean, that's ludicrous. That'll never work. But I don't don't blame anybody for thinking like that, because the whole thing's set up for you to think that your answer lies in some action that the system can take, and your participation in getting that action to happen is how they steal your energy. And just continue the cycles over and over and over again. You know, I just saw Bernie Sanders announce that he's running for president again, and he raised $6 million in the first 24 hours. And I just, shake my head. Like, when are people going to learn? A few summers ago, I met two wonderful young individuals. One was 18, the other was in their early 20s, and very, very intelligent young people. And of course, they were all about Bernie Sanders, and I tried to drop little hints here and there, explaining the situation to them, but they just couldn't see. I said, don't you kind of see how Bernie Sanders is the left version of Ron Paul? And do you see all of these people that fund Ron Paul? And do you see how they brought Ron Paul into prominence when Obama was elected? And then they started the Tea Party, and they had this whole countercultural movement planned into Obama's presidency so that you would put your energy there. And of course, they would never actually let Ron Paul do anything. He was just there to siphon your energy. And of course, the whole time they would claim that he was being censored by the mainstream, and they would say that the mainstream candidates were stealing his votes and all of that. And do you see how the exact same narrative is taking place with Bernie Sanders, just on the opposite side of the spectrum? Do you see that? Come on. They couldn't see it. They were too young and idealistic. They could see the right as the problem, and the rich, as it were, as the problem. And then they have this foil to that named Bernie Sanders, and so, he's the solution, right? And why am I even explaining this to the people listening to my videos? I don't know. Maybe a young Bernie Sanders supporter will come across this. So I'll just throw it out there. Please do not give your energy to this fake individual. My goodness. And if you guys don't know how to research this stuff, you don't pay attention to anything that they say. Go look at who is behind them. Look at who is on their staff. Look at the history of what they've been associated with. This is how you see the tentacles. Okay? This is how you work it out. Anyway. Pornography is an abomination. There's no other way to put it. I mean, facts. That's what it is. Obviously, it could be taken much deeper to darker places about how this is all interacting with pedophilia and that whole problem and the normalization of pedophilia, but I just don't even want to get into that right now. That's a whole nother subject. But you can see how, there's all kinds of that pornography in the underground being traded amongst people, and it's just heartbreaking. It really is. But that said, it's been going on for hundreds of years. I mean, if there is any legitimacy to some of what they portray as ancient Greek history, I mean, they openly talk about how these philosophers had young boys drugs that they use for those purposes and that they brought along in that way. Okay? This has been going on for a long time. This is a big problem we're talking about here. Pornography is only the latest manifestation of the disease. Okay? I mean, you talk about the LGBTQ thing and the normalization of that. Well, look at the founding fathers, quote unquote. They were dressing up in wigs and costumes, people. Do you see what's going on here? This has been happening for a long time. And the whole insane perversion of the whole thing is that people worship these characters. They put 4 of these faces on a mountaintop. They carved their faces into a mountaintop. These people that were dressing up in wigs. Ben Franklin throwing his wig on in his costume, and, all the bodies they found under the Hellfire Club in London. I mean, come on. It's a big problem. And I'm not trying to blame any one part of the problem. I just want everybody to see it for what it is. Okay? Because I'm subject to the problem just as much as anyone else. And it's a struggle for me too. Because it's psychological warfare, and I'm not immune to psychological warfare. Pornography is psychological warfare. And just like it happened to me, I'm sure it happened to you the first time that you saw those images. There's a reason that the Israeli army pumped that into the residents of Ramallah, right? It was a form of psychological warfare, a shock to their system that would provoke an end of their innocence if they had never seen those images before. The same way it happened to me and the same way it happened to you. And I know it's like quitting a drug. I get it. But if you have any hope of healing yourself, or at least beginning that process, you have to stop watching porn. And if you haven't done so already, it's time to start. Because this shit is toxic, and it's corrupting the minds of everyone in so many ways. I mean, I could go on and on and on about it, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. So I'll just leave it at that for now. You guys have a good one.